Welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science research podcast series at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, the first Sino-foreign university. I'm Dr. Mary Jane Ainsley, Associate Professor in International Communications.
And I'm Dr. Derek Irwin, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics. We're coming to you from the Language and Pedagogy Laboratory here at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences.
For this edition of the series, we are delighted to be joined by Professor Joost Herman. Joost is Professor of International Studies in the School of International Studies. Joost studied history and international law at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, earning his doctorate from Utrecht University.
Joost's research interests include international humanitarian action, disaster response, resilience building, globalisation studies, and the socialization of norms at societal level. His publications explore the intertwined processes of globalization, development, and humanitarian action, as well as the role of higher education in building resilient societies across the globe.
Yeah, there's a lot of info there. You okay there, Derek?
Big words. They were baffling me, but we'll get into them later.
Okay. In 2018, together with a number of international collaborators from around the globe, Joost published the article Building on the Capacities of Crisis-Affected Populations, From Victims to Actors, in the journal Development Policy Review. So, Derek.
Yes, Mary?
This was a very interesting article, and it was one that I found both fascinating and also quite challenging in that I felt it challenged a lot of presuppositions that I had, shall we say, towards this kind of area. And it made me realize, I think, how much victimhood as a term and as a concept dominates our understanding, shall we say, of, as the article says, crisis-affected populations.
Absolutely. I was telling you just before we came on the air, actually, that I really was pleased to read this because it did challenge a lot of my ideas, not just of the idea of victimhood and aid, but also just the whole realm. I learned quite a bit from it, which was extremely interesting because you think you know something about this at a kind of folk level. Yeah. And then when you delve into the actual scholarship on it, you realize you might not know as much as you thought.
You realize you know nothing, ultimately.
That's the real role of an academic, is to realize how little we know, right?
Yeah, we're the most self-aware people. We know that we know nothing.
I don't know many academics that are that self-aware. But let's get away from that.
It's just me? It's
just you, yeah. Enlightenment by Mary.
So moving back to the paper then, I think the sort of, as you say, the primary sort of fascinating concept I took from this is that constructing people as victims and constructing victimhood is actually something that can be very damaging to humanitarian actions. And I think whereas I was kind of aware that victimhood was a sort of very kind of controversial and not completely helpful term, I think I didn't realize that it could actually be very damaging as well.
Yeah, great. I learned quite a bit about the whole realm, but I think it's better that we ask the expert about this than have us pontificate. So, Joost, do you mind giving us a brief overview of the article and what you were trying to argue in it?
Welcome, Joost.
Welcome. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. It's great to be invited studio in this building, which I had never seen. So from that perspective, I also learned already a little bit from this conversation.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I think that's the first compliment we've had in our little studio.
That's right. It's barely falling apart at this point. But
yeah. And thanks for your warm words of welcome. Also concerning the article, I chose the article because indeed it combines a couple of issue areas, a couple of angles to the issue area that have bothered me and kept me awake sometimes at night over the past, basically 20 years or so. And it coincides with with a great effort in my previous employment that we made since the year 2005 to set up a serious study program on international humanitarian action, which was definitely not taken care of neither in political science departments or international relations departments or anthropology departments. And together with a couple of colleagues, one of whom is also represented in the list of authors, we made a great effort to catapult academia into the relevant issue area of international humanitarian action, how it is shaped, how it is being integrated in a larger field of international relations, power politics, and especially how it affects people who are in need. And if we take a closer look at the article, then indeed I would like to say that 2 or 3 elements are worthwhile mentioning. Firstly, this concept of victimhood is as old as humanity. Now being here in China, I started to study a little bit more of Confucianism. If you see the earliest references in Confucianism about helping your neighbor, when he or she is in need, like in Buddhism or in Christianity or in Judaism, you can see that it is always a benevolent act of a person who looks next to him or her and sees somebody in need and decided to give some help to the other one.
Is this Samaritanism, that type of idea?
Correctly, yeah. And so for the past 5,000 years, this act of benevolence, this act of charity has always been dominating this area, also when it got internationalized, for argument's sake, since 1859, the Battle of Solferino, 1863, the creation of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. And for the next 150 years, when indeed it became an international subject, this idea of those who are in a position to do well can do well towards their fellow brethren in need has been very dominant indeed, and it is only since the early 1990s. When crises became more and more complex, that especially the humanitarian community itself started to question how ethically approvable their attitude towards victims of disasters was. So that's one element, this persistent idea of the victim in need of help, the victim as a powerless person who simply outstretches his hand to a benevolent person who is more often than not, very white indeed, and very male indeed, because the international humanitarian endeavor over the past 150 years has been a very white, male-dominated issue area.
Is this almost a shift from in a kind of neo-colonial realm then, to instead of being the masters of empire, to be the masters of aid or assistance?
Yeah, well, one could see it in this way. I would give a little bit more credit to those, especially after the Second World War, especially in the 1960s, who already were far removed from this colonial/neo-colonial idea. It was, in my opinion, more the ownership that was claimed by the rich societies, especially civil society in developed countries, that they felt the need to do whatever they could in order to come to the rescue of those who are in need because of natural disasters or man-made disasters. So that's one element that is strongly represented in the paper. The second element is indeed the sheer complexity of present-day disasters. In the old days, it was simple. There was either an earthquake or there was war, and you acted accordingly based upon the needs that you could identify for the victims to be properly addressed.
I did notice a term in here you used, so-called natural disasters. And is that because some natural disasters are somewhat man-made because there's this complication of climate change and things like that?
Yeah, certainly that's the most straightforward example that you can give, that present-day natural disasters are often human activity-induced disasters. So from that perspective, I'm not very good in environmental science, but climate change influences access to clean drinking water, for example. And we all know that the lack of access to clean drinking water induces conflict. and conflict is a man-made disaster. Yeah, but it is caused by a natural disaster, which is also man-induced. So from that perspective, the categories become more and more complex. What is also meant by this term complex disasters is that within the category of man-made disasters, the good old days of interstate warfare has gone. Most of the conflicts after 1991 have been intra-state conflicts, also not anymore simply a government fighting a rebel group who competes for power, but several factions within one and the same state, often a fragile or even a failed state, who are competing for power, who are competing for resources, who are reaching out to external parties, sometimes states, nowadays also private military companies. You know, the Wagner Group, for example, who complicate the picture tremendously, enormously, but also, what's it called in English, also raise the level of sheer brutality and violence to the utmost degree, in which targeting vulnerable groups that are already vulnerable, in which targeting of vulnerable groups becomes some sort of a hobby for the warring parties involved. The most obvious one is women.
Children.
Children, of course, but I was more thinking about the jurisprudence of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, who for the first time in the 1990s indicated that sexual violence against women is per definition a war crime.
Right.
And a crime against humanity. Systematized sexual violence against women. And we knew that already, but it was for the first time within international law recognized that by then had become some sort of a favorite tactic of warring parties, especially in intrastate warfare. So that's the second large element in this, represented in this article, victimhood. Next to victimhood, the topic that we just stressed out concerning complexity. The third one being the inner struggle of humanity, humanitarianism itself, to define itself and to recognize that international humanitarian action in itself is also a political act. For 150 years, the humanitarian sector has made the claim, we are neutral, we are impartial, we are wonderful people who are there only for the good of humanity. We want to do good.
Again, this seems very reminiscent of a colonial attitude that Derek was referring to before.
I can understand that reference, but from the perspective of the humanitarian community, yes, it was male-driven, yes, it was white-driven, but by then, early 1990s, the whole community had diversified already, and many of them, especially international non-governmental organizations, do come from Asian and African countries. It was much more this ethical, internalized ethical belief system that doing good, per definition, means that you are neutral and impartial.
Okay.
Because you do good towards humanity.
Okay.
And humanity is a shared category that we all feel acquainted to, as a result of which your actions need to be deemed by all those involved, especially in man-made conflicts, to be deemed as neutral, impartial, and therefore good.
So doing good means that you psychologically begin to remove yourself from a political position.
You do claim that you never were involved in any political position because you were part and parcel of the humanitarian community.
Okay.
And the best example is, of course, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, who is still one of the staunchest advocates of being a neutral and impartial organization. As a result of which they don't accept money from governments, for example. They don't take sides in conflict. They treat according to need and not according to demand. That kind of principles. It was in this growing complexity of crises, especially after the Cold War ended, that even the likes of MSF grudgingly, willingly had to acknowledge that the sheer presence of humanitarian organizations in crisis areas does influence the political situation. I want to say beautiful examples, but there are, of course, gruesome examples, are to be found, for example, in Angola in the 1990s when there were several civil wars ongoing, but also in the first African World War, the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it was proven beyond any doubt that the conflicting parties abused humanitarian organizations for their political gains on the battlefield by, for example, allowing organizations to enter certain areas where indeed dire humanitarian needs existed, but preventing them from going to other areas where the similar kind of humanitarian needs existed. So it was quite a shock to the community, although perhaps people knew it in advance already. Your presence is per definition a political act, is per definition of political influence. And the longer the humanitarian community tried to deny it, the more suspicious recipient communities, those who were in need of aid and wanted to receive aid, the more suspicious these communities became in seeing this classical display of we are neutral, we are impartial, we are here only to do good.
Listening to you talk about this makes me really understand what you said at the beginning of this session, which was that this bothers you and this keeps you awake at night. So I'm starting to see why that would be. I mean, many of the aspects though that you're referring to here seem somewhat obvious. You know, it seems kind of obvious that this would be a political act in this way and this would be used in some way. So I'm quite amazed and interested as to why you feel this hasn't been so addressed in essence and why this has been overlooked to such an extent.
Because it's very convenient to see yourself as a benefactor, as a benevolent person doing good, as one who bestows upon his fellow human beings who are in a less fortunate position, that you bestow your goodies. I'm exaggerating now, of course. That you bestow your good acts upon, and it gives you a very good feeling.
And your intentions may be extremely good,
of course,
presumably, but then there's that old.
But can also be deemed to be naive, and can also be deemed to be blind.
Sure.
So I mentioned Angola, for example. Great United Nations presence after the decolonization from Portugal. Civil conflicts break out. United Nations gets involved with various peace missions and tries to be so neutral that at a certain moment they started to condone gross human rights violations by either side. Up till the point that it became so embarrassing that the local population simply did not trust the United Nations anymore, while of course they said we are here to distribute humanitarian aid, we are here to restabilize society. But for many of the recipient communities, they were either helping Savimbi or what was the other name, Dos Santos, who's is not his daughter who is still in power at this very moment in Angola, 30 years on. They were simply seen as complicit to human rights violations. Do you remember the bombing of the United Nations headquarters in 2003 in Iraq?
Yeah.
A great shock to the system. The then perceived future Secretary General of the United Nations killed the Melo Branco. Everybody was shocked, amazed. How can this be? The United Nations was there in Iraq after the American invasions to do good, to restabilize society, to help the Iraqi people back on its feet again. But they were driving around in American armed vehicles for their own protection. For most Iraqis, the UN was simply a tool in the hands of the United States of America. They were
symbolically
absolutely not deemed neutral anymore. And so to put it bluntly, they asked for it by siding so much with the Americans for security reasons. Of course, I also don't want to drive on a landmine or what's called an improvised explosive device.
So this really helps, Joost, because it explains some of the questions that I had when, there's a statement in the paper that says, the experience of past efforts where humanitarian organizations have chosen to put powerful actors' security objectives at the center over local and national actors proved detrimental to the security of humanitarian actors and the populations they sought to support. So these are those type of examples, are they?
Correct, and that is something that the paper tries to demonstrate, that out of this urge to keep on claiming that the humanitarian community is neutral and impartial and only there for the benefit of humanity, this triangular relationship which exists between humanitarian action, development and peace building has been long deemed to be some sort of a poisonous chalice for the humanitarian community. The humanitarian community didn't want to have anything to do with development. Development is politics.
Right.
Restabilization of society, peace building, that's politics. We can't get involved in politics. We
have to be impartial.
I equate myself now with the community, but the humanitarian community had to be seen administering medicine, housing, shelter, access to clean water. And then when the situation had more or less restabilized, I mean, from a humanitarian needs perspective, then you would go on to the next crisis. And that has created some sort of a self-isolation of the humanitarian community in this complexity of crisis where the humanitarian community should be involved in the process of politics, should be involved in the process of redevelopment, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and in the end, normalcy of society.
So where does victimhood come into this, which is one of the sort of central points of the paper? And why is victimhood so damaging? And how does it engender these problems that you are singling out?
Yeah, the term victim, of course, comes back in all the aspects that we have been speaking of up so far, that the humanitarian community downgrades the victims of disaster to helpless beings who are only there to receive aid and should be grateful for it. So that the humanitarian community can then move on to the next crisis. There's this wonderful cartoon, I didn't bring it with me, but there's this wonderful cartoon in Le Monde by Plantu, where the arch-typical depiction of a victim, a very thin very black African child, stretches his hands out to two very tall white gentlemen dressed in colonial suits, of course, and he says, "Thanks for saving my life today, will you come back tomorrow?" And that was a very, very almost painful depiction of the repetitive process of having to deliver humanitarian aid if you do not address root causes of why these crises emerge, why these disasters erupt. And that is one of the most strongest indications that the humanitarian community in the course of the 1990s, but especially the 2000s, came to the realization, if you keep on looking down upon those you are willing to assist so that they can return to a dignified livelihood, as it's called, a situation of normalcy, like you and I want to be in, endowed with rights, then we should stop treating them as victims, but see them as empowered human beings who, by unlucky chance, at this very moment, are not in the possession of their full human rights catalogue.
But have agency, or could be given,
definitely.
Or not given agency, I guess is wrong.
Have their agency restored.
That's right, yeah.
One of the most kind of disturbing sort of elements that I did pick out of this paper was the notion of a hierarchy of victimhood, that some people are more deserving than others.
Yeah, certainly. All this kind of very human behavior also is represented in the humanitarian community, that organizations, by tradition, there have always been Christian organizations involved, the World Council, what's it called? Can't remember the name at the moment, but there are a lot of Christian organizations. There are Muslim organizations who indeed, if only automatically almost, will favor their own communities, and sometimes also have very good reason to do so, because they can better interact with these communities and have more effectiveness in administering humanitarian aid from that perspective. But indeed, also at different levels, there's some sort of an knowing triage, if you like, a kind of triage that happens in the field when humanitarian organizations go into crisis areas where needs are overwhelming and choices have to be made. And the adagium is, of course, we only work on a needs-based approach. There where needs are highest, we will go. But in reality, on the ground, choices are made.
Well, deciding who is most in need, I suppose, is one of the primary ones. Right?
But in a conflict situation, that is very difficult to do. And the closer you are to the ground, the more difficult it is to have an overview. So, another famous example, MSF, eastern parts of Congo, just in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. MSF, neutral impartial, goes into Goma, starts treating victims. As it appeared to be, later on it was established that several members of the Hutu militias with wounds as a result of their actions committing genocide on the Tutsis went into Goma because they knew there was excellent medical service over there and given by MSF, had their war wounds being patched up and simply ran off back to continue their genocidal activities.
Right.
And no doubt, as a doctor, I'm not a doctor. Yeah, well, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. If you see a person with a horrible bullet wound next to a broken leg, of course, you will choose to treat the bullet wound first because that's more life-threatening. But at that very moment, many, or later on, with the benefit of hindsight, many people thought this made MSF more or less complicit to the ongoing genocide on 800,000 Tutsis.
Right. To step back just a sec, Joost, you were talking about things like religious groups getting involved in humanitarian aid. And so this struck me that there's a mention in the article about this historic legacy of humanitarian aid and its linkage to the idea of charitable giving. And it's a giving-receiving relationship. Which is identified in the article as a hindrance. Can you maybe expand on that? Why that particular humanitarian aid, charitable giving is should it be decoupled, for example?
That's a very difficult question to answer without indeed going almost into some sort of theological corner. For argument's sake, 1863. The creation of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Henri Dunant, of course, being a Christian, but decoupling it from Christianity, creating an organization that will go there where needs are visible and need to be addressed. Nevertheless, Christianity, after several centuries of being relatively dominant in world history, endowed this spirit of charity with a very Christian inspiration, one would say.
Right.
And that lingers on, even in the heydays of the 1960s when in my own country, the Netherlands, hundreds of solidarity committees were founded by concerned citizens who blamed the United States for horrible policies in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, or wherever else. You can still feel the religious undertone that it will make us. We were mostly Protestant, so we are a little bit more serious than Catholics. It will give us some kudos, if you like, in the larger religious framework of having done good with your life on earth. Right. And therefore being more qualified to any kind of aftermath, in a pleasant place. I exaggerate now, but this undertone was still there.
Yeah.
It's also, charity was also kind of egoistic act, if you like. Many benefactors in the Middle Ages indeed thought that they would buy their direct access to heaven by being benefactors to the arts, to the poor, to God knows what. Yeah, so although Dutch society already at that moment was deeply desecularized, this undertone is still there. But what you are doing with this dormant coupling with religious beliefs is that you do not treat those who are in need of assistance, that you do not treat them as equal human beings with endowed rights.
Particularly if they're non-Christian.
For example.
Because there's the effort often to convert or to make conditions on
that's the whole history of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, for example, that we at a certain moment said, okay, we have been rather brutish colonial masters, but now we will become benevolent colonial masters and we will bring you to maturity. Wait a moment, not now, not next year, but if you wait long enough, we will educate you, we will civilize you, and then at a certain moment you will qualify for independent statehood. And even in 1948, after 1945, he said, no, it is still too early for you. So please wait. And it was only because of the United States of America forced us to give up Indonesia that in 1948 we actually did give up Indonesia. There's this inherent looking down upon a helpless victim that is was deeply ingrained in the humanitarian community, which I would relate back indeed to the deep religious undertones, especially coming from Christianity. I'm simply not an expert on Islam.
No, it's very interesting to hear. My own understanding comes from the kind of indigenous communities in North America, and very much that was, helping them for their own good, but doing irreparable harm.
I almost feel like we're doing a bit of a disservice to the humanitarian community in this way, because you see this so much in, for instance, the creative industries as well. Like you see kind of documentaries made about suffering in such a way, which have this quite sort of disturbing emphasis upon victimhood in this way too, and the sort of humanitarian sort of benevolent kind of attitude you see of kind of backpackers around the world, kind of, sort of thinking that they're rebuilding houses and all the rest of it. So I think it almost feels like this is something that goes beyond this specific community. But I also feel, talking together, this is getting very pessimistic. And on the whole, I have to say...
May I add to this pessimism then? Because
we should always add to the pessimism.
I know. I checked the figures this morning, coming from the annual report of the Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations, who is also Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. At this very moment, there are 305 million people in direct need of humanitarian aid. So that is not the absolute worst category that they will not survive the next day, because that's approximately 125 million people that would be in need of direct humanitarian assistance to survive at present. But 300 million is quite a large number. There are at this very moment 123 million people who are either refugees, so internationally recognized refugees under international refugee law, or internally displaced persons, so people who are on the run for violence within the limits of their own state. The Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations assumes that for the year 2025 we are in need of approximately $50 billion in order to address all those needs, and he can predict already that half of that demand will not be met.
Well, and we're seeing a reduction in aid from the U.S. in particular, right?
This report was written before the wonderful Mr. Trump became president and started to demolish U.S. aid.
Right.
But it's always nice to criticize Mr. Trump. Many governments in Europe, including my own, in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy, have drastically reduced their spending on international development aid and international humanitarian aid. Your own people first. That seems to be the kind of philosophy that is nowadays very popular in populist
You
circles.
weren't joking when you said let's get more pessimistic, because this is going completely sort of downwards.
The number of refugees is the highest number since the end of the Second World War.
I have to say, as much as I enjoyed your paper, it was a real kind of, whoa, things are getting worse as regards, not better. But if we can sort of maybe pick things up a little bit, you state how it's really important in the paper that humanitarian action must be an empowering process that shifts from a victim to an actor, all right? So that makes somebody move from a position of victimization to one of much more empowerment. And that's actually key to kind of changing this attitude and mentality and actions. How exactly should an institution go about that? I mean, what is key to making sure that change happens?
Firstly, but that's a very academic answer, we have to have much more knowledge. The paper was co-written with 3 people of University College Dublin, one of which is my partner in crime, Dr. Pat Gibbons, with whom I worked together on creating this so-called network on humanitarian action, this academic-driven network of knowledge build-up in the humanitarian sector. That is what we have been busy with since the year 2005. And that was sponsored greatly by DG Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection of the European Union, of the European Commission. So a policy-oriented institution that endowed quite a bit of money to the academic build-up of knowledge creation. And that is very important because the lack of knowledge more often than not is indeed seducing people into the easiest way out. You give your aid, you pat the little black boy on the head and you move to the next victim. Don't think. If you start feeling compelled to think, then you're in trouble because crises are complex. Another one of the more gruesome examples. UNHCR having these repatriation, no, that's not the proper word, but anyways, this allocation program for refugees singled out for repatriation to safe countries, for example, Western European countries. And at a certain moment, I believe it was in Congo, the local representatives of UNHCR signaled a significant rise in female mutilation. What's it called again?
FGM.
Yeah.
Or FGC is the more academic term.
Okay. So mutilation of women's bodies. And that was so significant, this increase, since they had arrived in that particular refugee camp, that they started to do an investigation. And they found out that mothers were deliberately mutilating their own daughters so that they would give them a better future. That they would be selected for patriation to the Netherlands or to Germany or to Australia or whatever. Can you imagine? That your own mother,
unfortunately, you could imagine,
does this in order to secure a better future for the child who is indeed locked up in a miserable situation with no prospects at all. Now, that is only one example of how incredibly complex crises have become, and why going in straightforward with blindfolds, with absolutely no knowledge about the local situation, in the end always results in making the wrong choices.
Right.
That you cannot prevent that. There's one academic, Mary Anderson, who in the mid-1990s wrote a famous book titled Do No Harm. And that book was a direct attack upon the image that the humanitarian community was there to do good. And her basic line of reasoning was, you will never be able to do good.
Right. Flip
At least what you can try to do is don't make the situation worse than it is already. Do no harm. And that has become some sort of a Bible. Well, to remain in Christian terms, that has become some sort of a Bible for the community. That is perhaps the best achievable result that you can expect. Do no harm. Don't make things worse than they are already.
Yeah. And anything above that would be a bonus, presumably.
Yeah. If it can be delivered in a fair and equitable way with not longer term damage instead of benevolent effects.
So with this particular article, we're always interested to know what the reaction to publications is. And have you had any criticism of this? I assume that the basic proposition isn't criticized that much, the idea of, shifting victims to agents. But have you received any criticism of the article?
Not so much from academic circles, because, let's be honest, it was also becoming some sort of a mainstream argument that, like with so many international conferences, we mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit. I was there in Istanbul in 2016, and there were 9,000 people in the room, inclusive Mr. Erdogan, inclusive who was then Vice President of the United States of America, I seem to have forgotten. They were all there, and they say, we want to do good. Of course, everybody in front of the cameras wants to do good. And this time we will make the reform work. And this time we will treat victims of disasters as local agents who are anyway there first as first responders, who are knowledgeable about the situation, who can direct us instead of us coming in, trampling all over the floor, saying what they need to do, and then go away to the next crisis. That's another interesting book written by a Dutch journalist, which is called The Crisis Caravan, in which he depicts the whole international humanitarian community as one large group of the caravan refers, of course, to this row of camels in the old days on the Middle Eastern routes, but as a kind of group of vehicles that moves from one crisis to the other. And as soon as they have delivered in front of the camera their goodies, then they will go to the next crisis, because you have to satisfy your donors. If your donors don't see you hopping from one crisis to the other, they will think that you're lazy, that you don't score any effects at all. Mm-hmm. And if you try to explain, but we are here now in Bosnia, 1995, everybody thought that we would be away in 1996. It's now 2025, and we are still there because Bosnian society has not restabilized.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The conflict situation is still there. But you can't explain it to your donors. They want results. They want instant results.
Yeah. What do you hope that you will actually achieve from this paper?
What we definitely hoped to achieve or hope to achieve is indeed that, and that refers to your earlier question, that there is still a considerable segment of the humanitarian community that keeps on clinging on to this neutrality and impartiality bit. Mm-hmm. This staunch belief in, as long as you profile yourself in any conflict area or in any disaster area as being the good Samaritan, being neutral and impartial, in the end you will achieve greater effectiveness in delivering humanitarian aid than whilst you adapt to the more modern ideas as international humanitarian action, part and parcel of the palette of political actions that are being undertaken in certain issue areas, in certain conflict areas. That they are called the classical humanitarian organizations, and again, ICRC and MSF are definitely the representatives of those. If you would put it very, very nastily, are still living in this old-fashioned world of interstate warfare, in which Henri Dunant got caught up in 1859, saw two armies fighting with one another and leaving their poor wounded soldiers on the battlefield to die, while they could be easily treated. That was very easy. That was that was not so difficult to digest where the needs were, why you should help, and why this situation also could be relatively quickly resolved.
And even neutrally, presumably,
of course,
because you have clear delineation between the sides.
And if you're not willing to admit to yourself as an organization that these conflicts nowadays have become so terribly complex, then you are destined to make mistakes. You are destined to have less effectiveness than when you were willing to take in the local situation and the power play that is present.
Do you think that you are part of a wider group and consensus of academics who are actually challenging this? I presume it's not just you. There must be kind of a movement here towards questioning and challenging this.
Yeah, academics are also human beings. Huh? That's a worrisome
just
qualification.
About,
No. I'm making the joke because we started with this NOHA network, the Network on Humanitarian Action, quite early on, already in 1993, when also DG ECHO, DG Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection of the European Commission, was being created. But it came to full blossom in the 2000s. And we were unique. At a certain moment, we had a global network of 22 universities. We had outreach to a variety of non-governmental organizations who were willing to supply us with guest lectures and training sessions for students, etc. Well, it was wonderful. But as soon as other academics, other institutions saw how successful this was, everywhere in the world, every university wanted to have a humanitarian action center or a humanitarian studies department. So over time, there has grown a lot of competition when it comes to the academic attention to humanitarian studies. In itself, a good thing. The more knowledge is being built up, the better it is. But it also became a little bit fashionable to devote part of your academic staff to international humanitarian studies. Yeah, so that's that is one thing that always struck me, that there is a kind of outreach from academia into issue areas where they think that they will also get a lot of students.
There's self-interest, of course.
Yeah, that's for sure.
What are your plans for the future then? How do we take this forward what are you working on now?
Yeah. The lucky, peculiar, whatever kind of circumstance is that I'm in China at this very moment. And so I'm refocusing my research now a little bit to the state level instead of to the international non-governmental level, because I want to find out how China is incorporating international humanitarian assistance in its foreign policy.
Right.
There has been a great reform in 2018, in which a larger amount of coordination took place within the Chinese government when it came to incorporating international humanitarian assistance in its foreign policy. Up until 2018, it was dispersed, it was fragmented, nobody knew who was doing what at the same time. But you can see in the wider picture of Chinese foreign policy, China wants to be a more dominant actor in international humanitarian assistance at large, and international multilateral humanitarian action in particular. And that is a very interesting development, because I exaggerate now, but China was always more interested in bilateral relationships with other countries, including when it comes to delivering aid. For example, after Hurricane Haikan in Malaysia, nowadays in the earthquake aftermath in Myanmar, you can still see that China believes that via bilateral channels you can exert more influence.
Right.
Nevertheless, the Chinese government has also decided that it is very good for their public profile and for their effectiveness if they would engage more with multilateral institutions. So the United Nations, cooperation with the European Commission, but also, for example, cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, who have an office in Beijing, which is already there for quite a while, but the cooperation with which, especially over the past 2 years, has been increased significantly. So China is repositioning itself in the wider humanitarian field, and I find that very interesting. And I want to find out why and how. And of course, the accelerator was COVID. Because you can see in the statistics of aid provided that in 2020 the contribution of China goes skyrocketing high, but that was basically because they sold all this medical mouthpieces, etc., to African countries and the vaccines, etc. But it's now interesting to see whether this heightened contribution of China will be consolidated, and indeed whether this interaction, if not proper coordination between multilateral organizations and China takes a foothold. And again, given the fact what is happening in the United States of America, it may be a golden opportunity for China to upgrade its own profile in this respect. Also, governments like humanitarian aid because it's sexy, it's beneficial, right, for your image. Why do you think that US aid was there? Not only because of humanitarian reasons, because it was an instrument also of American foreign policy.
Well, it feels like coming to China was, and to UNNC was absolutely the correct thing for you. I'm really interested in seeing what answers you come up with.
I really look forward to seeing more. Yeah, that sounds great, Joost.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Joost, for joining us and for sharing your really fascinating and very important research.
Yeah. Well, you get from my tone that I'm like talking about a subject.
We like hearing about it, so thanks again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With 110 academic staff from 22 countries and regions, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science is committed to delivering world-class teaching and research, with a growing focus on interdisciplinary projects. Our faculty includes the School of Economics, the School of Education and English, the School of International Communications, and the School of International Studies, as well as the Language Centre.
We are committed to internationally renowned and excellent research in a thriving transdisciplinary environment of outstanding individual and collective research. Our faculty is home to a number of groundbreaking projects, including but not limited to digital heritage, game cultures, the historical and contemporary Silk Roads, health economics, cognitive neuroscience of language, and gender studies.
The Faculty of Humanities and Social Science is also proud to host a high percentage of international staff who bring expertise to areas such as history, politics, journalism, media and film studies, education, English, micro and macroeconomics and more,
as well as a wealth of experience from international universities.
We strive to offer an education and student experience reflecting the most up-to-date knowledge and achieve this through the close integration of teaching and research. Our research-led teaching places cutting-edge knowledge at the center of our curriculum, while our academic staff actively engage our students in their ongoing research activities.